This is the BBC.
This podcast is supported by advertising outside the UK.
Thanks for downloading the In Our Time podcast. For more details about In Our Time and for our terms of use, please go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. I hope you enjoy the programme. Hello. At the turn of the 19th and 20th century, we saw the birth and rise of psychoanalysis. Championed by Sigmund Freud, people began to think about how the mind functioned and how our behaviour might be understood through the process of working with a psychoanalyst, either one-to-one or in a group. Freud thought a lot about this process, and in 1922 he published Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego, in which he pronounced that the group, quote, wants to be ruled and oppressed and to fear its masters, unquote. Freud was writing at a time when ideas about rules and oppression were much discussed because the 20th century was also a century of fascism, totalitarianism and dictatorship. Freud died in 1939 just as a wave of despotism was sweeping across Europe. Today we'll be discussing the relationship between politics and psychoanalysis. To what extent does psychoanalysis function by the rules of a dictatorship, and to what extent does it function like a democracy? Is there a part of us that craves dictatorship, and if so, why? And is there a war going on in our own minds between ideas that we allow into our consciousness and others that we repress? With me to discuss psychoanalysis and democracy are Adam Phillips, psychotherapist and author of an excellent new book, Equals, and general editor of the new Penguin translations of Freud; Sally Alexander, professor of modern history at Goldsmiths College, University of London, and founding editor of the History Workshop Journal; and Malcolm Bowie, Marshall Foch, professor of French literature and fellow of All Souls College, Oxford. Adam Phillips, Freud was writing in the early part of the 20th century. Can you sketch out the political and historical background that informed his ideas?
In 1923, the young Adolf Hitler left Vienna in disgust, describing it as a Babylon of races. And I think the most significant thing about Vienna in the period in which Freud lived in it was simply the mobility of people. For example, in 1900 there were over 1.5 million people living there. Over half of them hadn't been born in Vienna. It was one of the capitals of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was a very strange and extraordinary country, if you like, because it was lots of countries. So it was a sort of prototype for what we call multiculturalism. The emperor, Franz Joseph, had ruled for 50 years, so you had the illusion of a stable empire, but actually the ethnic mix was extraordinary. There were Germans, Slovaks, Poles, Serbs, Italians, Hungarians, so an amazing mix of people. And there was, of course, with this, a strange, when people describe living in Vienna in the time that Freud was there, Freud came to Vienna in 1860, aged 4. Between 1860 and 1880, there were 8 different constitutions in Vienna. So you have a sense of a great deal of social, political, intellectual turbulence.
At that time, we have many ideas growing up, many political ideas, but let's take 2, and if you can give us your opinion of the impact that this had on Freud. The general development of ideas of equality and the emancipation of women, how did they affect him and affect his thinking?
Well, I think Freud was living in this kind of what is politely called a melting pot. Freud was very aware of the sense in which there were, as it were, repressed voices in the culture. That certain people were, as it were, allowed to speak and certain people weren't. Certain people could be heard and certain people were not given a voice. Now, it seems to me of interest, although there's not a simple causal relation here, that Freud is writing about, if you like, the dissenting voices inside the individual. Freud is saying that we're made up of competing voices that can't always be reconciled.
Malcolm Bowie, Freud wasn't explicit about politics in his work, as I understand it, but political references did work their way into his metaphors and analogies. Can you give us some examples of this?
He talks at a certain point about the ego struggling against superior agencies, and he reaches for a number of political metaphors in doing this. One of them is that the superego, that's to say the force of conscience, of repression, of correctness, of authority, resembles a tyrant, and the ego, having created its own tyrant, as it were, then submits to its policies and its often very cruel and vindictive measures. So there's an implicit micropolitics caught up in the structure of the mind in one of his central models of what he calls the psychical apparatus. And of course the id is some sort of rabble, an array of anarchic forces needing to be controlled by the ego on the one hand, and always running the risk of being over-controlled by the superego on the other hand. So there's some sort of tripartite class system caught up in one of Freud's models of the mind.
The superego, the tyrant, the ego, the constitutional monarch, and the id,
exactly.
The unruly
constitutional
populace.
monarch is the
Yes.
phrase he uses.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so all very neat. All very neat. How important was this to him?
He was very good at putting down agendas for the future of psychoanalysis. He said at a certain point in the 20s, in due course, we need a college of psychoanalysis, and an agenda item for this future college of psychoanalysis was the interface and the interaction between the individual subject and the social and political order. And in Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego, as it's called in English, published in 1921, he sketches out a plan for the joint and interactive study of minds and social formations of one kind or another, and says psychoanalysis must attend to this. We can't at the moment get very far, but in due course we will be able to talk to political scientists and even possibly to active service politicians about that extraordinary interference zone or grey area between individual minds in action and social activity generally.
Just to stick for another 2 or 3 questions to the time of Freud's time, at the time in which Freud lived, for instance. He was intrigued by censorship in Tsarist Russia, and this is an example, as I understand, of the way that he took something that was happening on a political front and applied it to the mind.
The strange propensity that the mind has is the propensity not to know about itself or not to know fully about various matters that one would have imagined it had complete access to. There's a mechanism somewhere in the human mind that wants not to know, as well as a mechanism that wants to know. He talks very movingly about the desire to know, the Wisstrieb, so-called. But there's another desire which is to do with repression, not letting things up into consciousness, not willfully not understanding or not grasping or not remembering things that have been the case in the history of the individual. And one of the ways he talks about that is that there's a mechanism which blanks things out, which takes mental materials, rather as the censors at the border took incoming newspapers, the Russian border, and removes entire columns. And he thinks this is a particularly potent metaphor for various things that are going on endemically, innately in human minds.
So, Alexander, Freud and Einstein corresponded, and they corresponded also on the subject of war. What conclusions did Freud draw about power relationships between groups in society?
It's an interesting exchange. He was pessimistic about the aggressive instinct ever being able to be eliminated in civilization. The aggressive instinct was innate and driven and powerful and could only be curbed by encouraging love, by encouraging eros, by encouraging the ties between communities. He felt you could never, or he believed that you could never eliminate the aggressive instinct. On the other hand, he concludes his exchange with Einstein with a very interesting and rather enigmatic point where he argues that civilization is progressive. It is leading towards, slowly and in very uneven ways, towards control of the instincts. This can be seen very clearly in the control of the sexual instincts. He was writing in the early 1930s when the birth rate was falling all over Europe and the Western world. He said, look at the sexual instincts, they're already being controlled. We're in danger of extinguishing ourselves by controlling the sexual instincts, the instincts of love. So perhaps there's a hope that we might also be able to equally, through the development of civilization, through the education, as it were, of our instincts, control aggression.
Glancingly, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, but it is of interest to me anyway, maybe of no interest to you, that he is talking so profoundly about the aggressive instinct in the 30s. He doesn't seem to see Nazism coming along at all, even after Kristallnacht.
Yes, it's extraordinary, and it's not uncommon at the time. I mean, this was a man who believed deeply in rational thought, in education, in the powers, the qualities of civilization to overcome the irrational. I think perhaps at this time he certainly saw the evidence of despotism around him and fascism and didn't flinch from its irrationalities, but he wouldn't have been alone in believing that the forces of civilization...
Whether he's alone or not, it's extraordinary that he is actually talking about this thing with such profundity that we're still talking about it now,
yes.
And he didn't see smacking him in the face.
There may be another point here, which is that it may be that people develop an idea of an internal world when external reality becomes intolerable. So there may be something quite paradoxical going on here, because it's true, if you read Freud's correspondence, there are very few references to political reality. And we know, if you read social histories, extraordinary things are going on in his world, and yet he's talking about what's going on inside people. And it may be that there's a paradoxical sense in which he works out this intolerable external reality by translating it inside and dealing with it in a very, very small group of people.
Can we talk about equality and superiority, Adam, which one of the things you discuss in the book, which I enjoyed so much. Freud said, what about this idea of Freud's idea that the group wants to be ruled and oppressed and to fear its masters? Quite a powerful statement. Would you address that, please?
I think what Freud is very mindful of is how frightened people are of themselves. Freud is producing a picture of people which makes them feel that there's a fear around, and it's obviously reflected in external political reality, that no one is in charge. It's as though people are feeling that they're being abandoned with all these instinctual desires, with all these internal competing claims. No one knows how to organise it. And I think, obviously this is part of a larger social reality, but Freud is beginning to feel that there is a craving to have a parent-like figure to submit to. It's a bit like the idea that, if God's dead, what that means is there's nobody left who knows who we are. So Freud is saying there's a craving among people whose societies are beginning to fall apart to have somebody who is in charge, who knows what's going on, and who is able to actually tell them which parts of themselves they should value, which parts of themselves they should repress.
So it's a longing to be subservient, it's a longing to be subjugated. Do you think that's true? Would you think that's true, Malcolm?
He makes a very interesting distinction in the group psychology book between led groups and leaderless groups. But the really dangerous thing in his analysis is the leader-led group, because the ego latches on in his account to certain figures with dangerous intensity, subjugates its own demands to the claims of figures that are, to a very large extent, phantasmal creations of the ego itself. And one can see this working very well in the 1930s with the rise of Nazism. So the analysis is really quite profound of that within individuals, which seeks masochistically to be under the rod of powerful leader figures, which have themselves been produced by a needy and insecure human individuality. So there's a potentially very powerful explanatory device for the discussion of various forms of political allegiance and various forms of acquiescence in tyranny and brutality and so forth.
Sally Alexander, do you think it's wishful thinking to think of a society without hierarchy?
I think there were, at the same time that Freud was living and thinking and working about developing and all these analysts were kind of building up their international movement, the emergence of the women's movement, which was organised democratically, the labour movement, which was organised democratically, that there's plenty of evidence from the historical period then and in the early 20th century and right through the 20th century to see that there is a very powerful craving in people for equality, for democracy, for non-hierarchical forms of government, of self-control, of organising ideals and fantasy lives and so on.
But how do you see the balance, Adam? You argue in the book, in Equals, that, quote, without superiority existing in a person's orbit, we are destitute. Again, that's very powerful. You're emphasising the craving for superiority, and equality at this stage in the argument doesn't seem to have the same cylinders.
There's a quasi-Freudian story that Sartre tells about a young married couple. Every morning, the couple come down together, they have breakfast, the young wife kisses her husband goodbye, he goes off to work, and she sits by the window crying all day. And when the husband comes back, his young wife perks up. Sartre says the obvious interpretation of this story is that the woman is suffering from a terrible separation anxiety. But actually, Sartre says what's going on is that when her husband leaves for work, she can do anything she wants. So she's suffering from a fear of freedom. She's got a whole day in which she could do anything she wants. Now, if we just slightly Freudianise this story, we'd have to say that she is destitute in that day because she'd rather be destitute than deal with her own freedom. This is what Sartre would say. And her own freedom in Freudian terms would simply be her desires, what she actually wants to do with her day. Now,
yeah, absolutely. No. I was just. This is my listening face. I was just.
Oh, I'm sorry. I wasn't sure which face it was.
I wasn't saying stop.
Well, I'll continue then.
Please do.
Now, I think it's an interesting parable, this, because it's one version of why at an individual sort of microcosmic level, what's going on when somebody recruits somebody to, in inverted commas, look after them or govern them or consents to their own oppression. So what's going on at the same time as Freud is developing a very deterministic theory about how we are really driven, there could be no freedom, there are also people like Sartre who are using bits of Freud to develop an existential theory which is actually about the fear of not being governed. But not only not being governed externally, but also not being governed internally. So that there's nothing we can have recourse to inside ourselves that will tell us what we should do. All we can do is make choices and see what the consequences are.
So, Alexander, were there specific events in the 20th century that provoked the idea that if we don't have leadership or superiority, there will be anarchy? Were there specific outside political events that showed, look, that is the anarchy that will happen to us and to the mind if we don't fall into line, really, have a hierarchy?
The Russian Revolution was not just vivid in people's minds, but a very real immediate, just across the sea, and the threat of revolution appeared vividly in the minds of the governing classes in Britain as in other European nations. Very high levels of unemployment immediately after the First World War. The incompetence with which demobilisation was organised also led to real fears that there would be industrial unrest, which might lead to revolution. The general strike, interestingly, was rather reassuring because working people revealed their extraordinary self-discipline and capacity for democratic organisation in the general strike. And so, apart from, setting the tremendous amount of anxiety among the TUC leadership and so on, in fact, the general strike was rather reassuring in its effects. It was, again, economic depression in the 30s and the unrest of the unemployed and the demonstrations of the unemployed, which led some members of the governing classes to fear that there would be revolution.
I want to come to the element of democracy, which I found the most gripping in this new book of yours. One of the key points is that, Adam, is that society and individuals should learn to accept the conflicts that occur between different ideas. They shouldn't try to suppress, as I understand it, one in favour of the other. Are you saying that psychoanalysis should therefore offer no... are you saying psychoanalysis should offer no answers to conflict, although most people think I go to psychoanalysis to get out of conflict? And B, are you saying if it doesn't do this, then it is actually a very important way to look at democracy?
Yes.
So there's two questions there.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, the answer to that is certainly. I think that the aim of the psychoanalysis that I value is to enable people to be able to bear and sustain the conflicts without having to resolve them. Ernest Jones, who was one of the earliest psychoanalysts, said a very interesting thing, which is that we don't want to kill the person we hate most. We want to kill the person who evokes in us the most unbearable conflict. So, for example, we might want to kill certain kinds of terrorists, not because we hate them, although consciously we might think this, but because they evoke a conflict in us that we cannot bear and sustain. Now, I think this is a very important idea. And I think what Freud is saying, and I think this is the democratic bit, is that we depend upon conflict. It's our lifeline. We think consciously we must resolve them. We really need to solve our problems. I think there's another voice in Freud that says, actually, we need to be able to sustain them, because our conflicts are the bulletins from ourselves and from our cultures about the things that matter to us. But they're going to be competing claims. And it's very difficult to conciliate rival claims politically in the external world and internally in the internal world. But the aim is to make that bearable, not simply to abolish the enemy. It's to trade with the enemy.
Can you give us one or two, can you be rather specific, just to give listeners an example or two of what you're talking about, just so we can get hold of this?
Yeah. Let's imagine that I, as an adolescent, believe that I have to solve the problem of whether I am heterosexual or homosexual. Now, you could think that a good psychoanalysis or a good upbringing will resolve this problem for you. You will become one or the other. Actually, we both have a parent of each sex. So it's very curious, in a way, that we don't grow up, as it were, at least potentially or latently bisexual. Now, all the pressure in the culture thus far has been for this to be resolved. Now, in the kind of psychoanalysis I'd be talking about, it would be taken for granted that we are homosexual and heterosexual. Everybody's had a father and a mother, even if the father's been absent or indeed the mother's been absent. Nevertheless, everybody biologically and often emotionally has a mother and father. So the aim of development would not be to become one or the other. It would be to be able to bear the fact that one is in fact both, and then to evolve a world, which I think some people are trying to do now, in which such lives become practicable, in which you actually, for example, can bring up children and be bisexual.
Malcolm, would a sort of rather common but criticism of this would be to say, look, this is just saying anything goes. And basically what we wish to do in our minds is to resolve things. And that Adam's idea, which is can be said as, look, it's laissez-faire, leave it all alone, it'll all kind of sort itself out in the end. I am reducing it appallingly, but what is your reaction to that?
On the psychoanalytic couch, if one is fortunate enough to find oneself there and can afford to be there, sure enough, the treatment does allow one to explore things that otherwise are very difficult to explore. So it allows, as it were, hidden sexualities to emerge. It allows experimental journeys back into one's own past and into the formative influences from one's own childhood to be undertaken. And it's all very fine and dandy. And I wish it were more commonly available. I wish that psychoanalysis had invented ways of allowing that sort of introspection à deux, two-people introspection, to go on in a way that opens up a range of possibilities for the individual. But what we're faced with is a system, an approach, a set of texts and a set of procedures within psychoanalysis that are, in practical terms, available to very few people. We could talk about the reasons for that. Now, in the absence of the lessons of psychoanalysis available on a broad front, one can't help but ask oneself who is being served, to whom is good being done by psychoanalysis as some sort of closed-off protection racket for a certain fee-paying section of the middle class.
Yeah, that isn't quite what I was getting at. I mean, so Sally, can I ask the question I asked Malcolm to you, which is, do you think that Adam's right about this conflict idea, or do you think what it means is that if I have feelings of hatred, violence, vengeance, as well as feelings of affection and tenderness, what I should do is learn to live with the lot, not try to get rid of the bad bits?
I think there are two things in what Adam's saying. One is that there is the possibility of looking closely at conflict inside the self, if you like. The other is the difficulty that there is of actually being able to, in the psychoanalytic encounter or anywhere else, of actually allowing that conflict to be spoken at all, to even, the resistance to that knowledge. So I don't think it's laissez-faire, anything goes. I think the essay does point to the difficulty of knowing what it is we want to look at and resolve and deal with, being able to speak the conflicts at all.
And do you think it does give us some sort of model for democracy to bring it into the political arena again?
Yes, I think if you think of I'm sorry to jump from the, sublime to the whatever, but if you think of the difficulty and pain of the process of peace negotiations in Northern Ireland, for example, just getting people around the table to listen to each other or even to speak a sentence, then I think that the psychoanalytic encounter does have something to teach us, that it's very, very difficult and hard, as well as, if we can allow it to happen, it's important to be able to tolerate all these different voices and this conflict inside of us and between the analysand and the analyst.
To bring, Adam, what Malcolm said back into the loop in a way, in a sense he's saying, look, this democratic notion between two people and so which Sally has developed, is all very well, but it's happening to so very few people in such limited ways that paradoxically its general relevance in a democracy is extremely limited. So what do you make of that?
Well, I think Malcolm's right. I think that psychoanalysis, psychoanalysis should be very, very cheap. Anybody who charges people loads of money shouldn't be doing it. Originally, there was child psychotherapy available on the health service. Any taxpayer could get it. That was one of the great things about child psychotherapy. In private practice, people are charging people too much. So I think that for it to be genuinely democratic, it has to be made really available. And there may have to be, at least in the first stage, a Robin Hood principle, that wealthier people pay more to subsidise people who can't afford it. And it has to be known. Now, one of my wishes with this Penguin Freud is that people might become curious. And the people who become curious might be actually very pissed off that they can only have psychoanalysis if they've got £200 a week or £100 a week to spend on it. I think that's absurd. And I think people should then protest about this, and people should go into the profession who are more interested in doing the work than in making money. If they want to make money, they should do something else.
Malcolm, can I come back to something which you said very near the beginning of the programme? Freud expected more interchange between psychoanalysts and practical politics, as I understand it. Why hasn't that happened?
Getting politicians and practical folk sufficiently relaxed and sufficiently removed from the fray to think about their own underlying psychological processes, to think what has made them into the political creatures they are, it almost requires a utopian revision of our present ways of doing things before we can even begin to step in that direction. But how wonderful it would be if there were weekend seminars, weekend retreats for politicians and analysts to begin talking about these things jointly. One did see analysts from time to time, barricades in 1968 in Paris and on Ban the Bomb marches and during the heyday of CND and so forth. There is a kind of potential political militancy in the analytic community, but still very largely unrealised.
Can I just end with this, another quotation from you, Adam? Too much consensus is the enemy of democracy. What do you mean by that?
Well, that in a way it seems to be democracy thrives as the individual thrives on there being not too much agreement. There has to be competing claims. So one might be worried on a political or group level if too many people begin to feel too like-minded. One would have to wonder then what is being suppressed or what's being left out, because there's such a drive to avoid conflict that people might actually be setting aside things that matter to them in order to form the consensus and be part of the group. And that, I think, is the problem one's dealing with.
Do you find that, Malcolm? Would you agree with that?
An excess of consensus seems to me to be one of those, a sort of superior level of problem, if you like. When we've got a workaday consensus that allows us to rub along with each other, then let's worry about the excess of consensus. That would be my view.
Do you agree with that, Sally?
I agree that there should be conflict and there should be argument and that it should be encouraged and so on. Yes, I do. And I think it's very interesting that, if you think of the headlines in the posh papers about, the conflict between Blair and Brown, for example, I think, well, terrific if these two guys don't agree with each other and they argue all the time and the cabinet argues. I mean, this is exactly as it should be.
Yeah, what it should be about.
Completely right. Why on earth do we want, everybody to, Blair and Brown to agree with each other all the time? It's nonsense.
Well, there's been a depressing consensus at certain parts of this conversation. On the other hand, you managed to disagree quite enough. That's it. We've run out of time. Thank you very much, Malcolm, Adam, Sally. Thank you for listening. Thank you.
We hope you've enjoyed this Radio 4 podcast. You can find hundreds of other programmes about history, science and philosophy at bbc.co.uk/Radio 4.